Hello, and welcome to episode 60 of the Large Format Photography Podcast. My name's Andrew Bartram, and I'm joined by Erik Mathie and Frank Thorp. Hello, Erik.
Hey, Andrew. Well done. You nailed the name.
Hello, Frank. Hello, Frank.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's really great to have you on the show. Thank you for being with us. See, that's my best Simon Forster impersonation.
Yep. Well done.
Before I hand over to Erik to start the interview with you, he can ask you some questions. Just need to thank our previous guests who were Monica and Adam of the Nomadic Photo Arc. So, Frank, they're two lovely people who are traveling around the States with a trailer, with a darkroom, doing large format portraits of people they meet, in a nutshell.
Yeah, I think I might follow Monica on Instagram.
Yeah.
I would love to be able to do
Yeah, right? That's the dream right there.
Darkroom, that would be amazing.
But it's also like the hustle, because when we talk to them, they essentially have to like hustle from grant to grant, or like, residency to residency, to sort of like keep it going. So it's interesting how much of it's a dream, but it's also like the hustle, capital T, capital H,
I have an enormous amount of respect for people. And I have a lot of friends that I work with that go from grant to grant, or that are working on a freelance basis. And that you're right, that's the best way to describe it. It's a hustle. And it's a tough lifestyle to make it sustainable for something like that, for your passion of photography. And so it's always really impressive to see people make it work.
Yeah, I mean, even in photojournalism, right? And so actually, that's an interesting question. So you started, when I started following you, I was like, oh, dude, a guy shooting speed graphic on Capitol Hill. By the way, folks, for those of you who don't know, Frank, I want to say Frank Thorp, but Frank is what I thought was a full-time photojournalist on Capitol Hill, shooting oftentimes a speed graphic 4x5 of congressional hearings and in the halls and that sort of thing. But in reality, you've come from NBC as like a producer and reporter. So photography wasn't necessarily your first foray into media and journalism, right? So like, what is that? What is your actual background, Frank? And how did that sort of like meander its way into becoming this guy? People are like, oh, you're the large format photographer on Capitol Hill. Like it's a
little different. Yeah, it was definitely a journey. I've covered the Hill for over 10 years. So I've covered Congress in the United States for over 10 years. And I've always been passionate about photography. And it's been something that I've done even before when I lived in Haiti for a year and a half before I was on Capitol Hill. And I would spend most of my time with photographers and travel around with them and basically, ask them all the annoying questions of, how can I make these photos better and be like, just shoot more pictures. But when it came to Capitol Hill, I mean, I would just shoot stuff, just because I liked to do it as a part of my job as a producer and reporter. So, and I'm always in places where, I'm usually in good places to take pictures because
right.
My job is to be in the right place at the right time and cover events when people are talking, when it's newsworthy or if it's a big hearing or if it's a big, I covered the 2016 campaign. And so I've always just had a camera with me. And so I've always just kind of taken pictures. And I've also really befriended a lot of the photographers around me who have been really amazingly supportive of this whole thing. So I mean, but I would say maybe 5 years ago, I was really trying to figure out a way to like differentiate my work, and was looking for a way to kind of slow down. I was getting a little bored with the digital workflow and feeling like it was really just kind of the same thing over and over again. And so, I had talked to a colleague of mine who I was like, yeah, I'm thinking about trying to shoot film. And he's like, oh, I have all these film cameras at my house. Like, you should come by and try one. And he let me borrow a Hasselblad, which I still shoot with. And I was shooting with a Hasselblad, and another photographer for Getty, who has since passed away. He was like, "Hey, I see you're shooting with film. I have all these like large format cameras that I don't use anymore. Would you want to check them out? Maybe buy them?" And so
nice.
He actually brought in this. I mean, this is a podcast, but you can see it in the background. Here,
we can, but no one else can.
Yeah, it's okay.
Speed graphic, and I mean, it's the leatherette is taken off of it. It's just wooden, and it's just beautiful. And I started to. I mean, he was like, "Would you be interested in buying this?" I was like, "Yes, absolutely." And I mean, it was just like a total whim. He gave me an amazing deal, and the first time I ever actually shot with it was the impeachment inquiry hearings on Capitol Hill for the first impeachment of President Donald Trump. So it was kind of like one of those things that I was just like kind of rolling the dice. But the reality is that because my job is one in which photography is actually not a part of my job description.
Okay.
I'm able to kind of experiment and do different things like shoot large format. If photojournalism, or if I was a photojournalist walking around needing to file every hour or every day, I wouldn't have the luxury to be able to do this kind of stuff. So,
right.
Which has been really great. And everybody's been like the photographers and NBC has been really supportive of it. And they've been using the pictures in, kind of like feature stuff. It's not necessarily day-to-day coverage, but it's more featurey things. And so, yeah, I mean, it's been really good. It's been an adventure.
So when you first got your speed graphic, what was what was going through your mind? Do you think, well, I'm going to use this in, for making people's portraits or for capturing scenes? And, what were the obvious technical challenges and things that you had to overcome?
I mean, the first thing that I had to overcome was just the simple embarrassment of being, carrying around this enormous camera that everyone was looking at like you're totally insane.
We're familiar with this.
Yeah. And so, and to be honest, it is, I mean, you guys know, shooting large format is hard to do. Shooting it handheld is like not typically done at all. Speed graphics are built for that because they're old press cameras, I mean, and so, I mean, like relatively, right? Like,
right. Ouija, baby.
Right, exactly. Yeah. But I mean, with the big flash and everything, but I'm not shooting with a flash. I have those bulbs, but I think I'm, would probably get arrested for trying to bring something as explosive as one of those light bulbs in the Capitol. The obvious technical issues are that shooting handheld, particularly early on with this camera, I was not looking at the ground glass at all. So the viewfinder on that one is actually very, very accurate with like paired with the lens.
Mm-hmm.
So, the first time I ever shot it was like a real rolling the dice. It was like all right, well, I'm going to shoot these pictures just might not turn out, and I'll just decide to do something different and shoot with a Hasselblad or something like that. It turned out it was like spot on. So I was able to knock or to get the focus immediately. And I mean, this lens is like a 2.7, I think it is. Like, yep. So it's super fast. And so in the lower like light situations in those hearing rooms or in the hallways, I'm able to kind of try to do stuff. I still push the film, but also, I mean, like, those technical issues and the fact that, there might be some movement or there might be some imperfections is something that I kind of embraced. Because I think that, again, like the digital workflow, I mean, some of these new digital cameras, it's like cheating. It's like everything is going to be sharp exactly how you want it to be. And so, I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't take skill to take perfect pictures, because it definitely does. The photographers on the Hill are amazingly talented people. But I just found this to be actually like the technical issues to be like a challenge that I saw that I wanted to try. You know what I mean? Like, right. I wanted to prove to myself. I mean, my whole thing is like, people used to shoot these cameras in the past to cover events like this in the past. And so if they can do it, it still can be done.
Right.
It's not impossible to do. But it was almost like I was like challenging myself to see if it was even possible to do. And it was. So it was great. It was very cool.
Yeah. Well, and F27 in there, like you've got a razor thin depth of field. Like you kind of have to nail something. Like you have to nail something. Like your focus has got to be step on. Are you shooting like Ilford or Team or Tri-X 400? Are you just pushing to 1600 in there or 3200 or shooting like they don't even make Delta 1600 and 4x5, do they? It's 400 ASA max, to my recollection. So you just like cramming it up to 16 or 3200 and embrace the grain, as one of our fellow podcasters would call their show.
HP5 pushed to 1600.
Okay.
It's not been, I mean, to be honest, like the larger the negative, the less grain is an issue. And
right.
So, I mean, I do embrace the idea of like a grainy negative, which is, again, I mean, gives, like, I don't actually really want the stuff that I'm shooting with on film to kind of look like it would, like it's something that I could shoot digitally. You know what I mean? Like I want it to have a different feel. It has like a different vibe, a different kind of like soul to it. When you shoot it with, shooting it large format or shooting it even like 35. I mean, I've been like recently, and I know this is like the antithesis of the show, like shooting.
I think those are brilliant. Those are like Tri-X point and shoots, right?
Yeah. So
I didn't even know they made Tri-X point and shoots.
Neither did I. And I found them, a couple of months ago, and I was like, that's really cool. And I mean, it's like basically like a toy camera, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's terrible, and you have to kind of like be at a certain distance, but like, I mean, the idea that you can kind of use it with a flash. Anyway, that's an aside. But
oh no, I'll talk about that.
What stoked your love of film then? Was it something that's you've always been interested in, or your father or mother or brother?
I grew up. My aunt was like really artistic. I kind of grew up like artistic. I liked arts when I was younger. I didn't really do photography as a kid. My parents weren't really photographers. I just really liked looking at photography. I really liked looking at, those, I keep on thinking of like the year in review pictures and just thinking,
yep.
Photography spoke to me in a way that was, it invoked an emotion for me. And it was something that drew me in. And in terms of like what started with me in film, it was, like I said, it was just the idea of trying to try something different. And the idea of actually doing the process from start to finish was actually really appealing to me.
Right.
And of learning how to develop and print. I never had done a darkroom class in high school. So the first time that I had started, went to a darkroom, I did it in a community arts center in Alexandria, Virginia. And I mean, I went to the darkroom and, you put the paper in the chemistry, and I was like, wait, this is how it works? Up on the, I mean, like, it was like kind of embarrassing how naive I was to the whole process. And, but I mean, as soon as I got into it, it was, I mean, as I'm sure a lot of people that you've spoken to, got totally addicted to it. It's funny because, like it feels like all new and different too, for me. I mean,
right.
Going down rabbit holes and rabbit holes and rabbit holes on this stuff. But again, like a lot of the people that I encounter on Capitol Hill or just in DC generally, who are photojournalists, this is old news to them. I mean, this is like they're like, why would you go a step back and do this? We've already done this. And I mean, the reason why we don't do this is because this is a pain in the ass.
They're not wrong.
Yeah, and that's actually kind of what I kind of love about it. And I mean, it's opened up other opportunities for situations where, I mean, particularly, talking about being embarrassed about carrying that big speed graphic around. It's also opened up opportunities where, senators have come up and been like, that's a really cool camera. You should come and take my picture. And so it's kind of like a cool situation and has opened up different avenues for creative opportunities.
Do you find that it helps with a rapport as well? I mean, and the fact that you're also not you're not there as a press photographer. There's, you're there with another role, but that's not your main role. The fact that you've got this big camera and your role and your sort of day job, does it help break the ice a bit with these guys?
I think it does. I mean, I think that sometimes, particularly lawmakers don't really know what to make of me when I do that. I mean, because for instance, and just to give you like some context, a lot of the stuff, particularly like when it comes to like this, the disposable camera stuff or some of the more close-up stuff, that stuff happens in scrums in the hallways, like during votes for, Senate votes. You're just standing around, and the way that a lot of reporting is done is that we'll stand around with senators and groups in just circles and just ask them questions. And when you throw up a camera and just take a picture, it kind of changes the dynamic a little bit, because having a conversation with you face to face it's just different when all of a sudden you're not only asking questions and having a conversation, but you're also like shoving a camera in somebody's face. But at the same time, I think one of the reasons why I'm able to do what I do is because this place in particular, Capitol Hill in particular, everybody on Capitol Hill is uniquely accepting of the idea of having a camera shoved in their face. It's not really that weird. And so I think that, a lot of any weirdness that you would think of in normal times when you're walking around shoving a camera in somebody's face doesn't really exist on Capitol, because they're just so used to doing it. So I do think that, it's probably less like the rapport that's being increased by taking pictures in the moment, but it's more that if they stumble across my work, they actually have a respect for what it is. And
do you find that you're being more and more recognized as, there's I know you?
Yeah, and particularly in the last year and a half, with the success of that the photo essay I did after January 6th, talk about like it's become a thing where people actually recognize me for my photography, which has been a little bit of an adjustment, because I've been the one that's been able to kind of like float in the background and just take pictures, kind of just on, just it's for myself, although I share it. But I mean, it's been kind of like a little bit of a passion project for myself. But now it is a situation where people will come up and be like, "Hey, I absolutely love your photography. It's so great." So, which is very cool.
So if you had the opportunity, would you transition from producer type work to photography full time or half time even? Like if somebody was like, if NBC was like, "Hey, let's make this switch," or somebody else, like say an agency came up like French Marseille or, the granddaddy of them all, Magnum, whatever. And they're like, "Hey, we would like you to make a switch." Would you?
I've thought about that a lot, and I've had conversations with photojournalists about it. I think I worry for myself, because this has been such a personal thing that personal passion thing that I did, that I do get a little concerned that if it were to become like a full-time thing, if I would lose the passion for it, and which is, something that I think a lot of people worry about, making that transition. It would be a really amazing opportunity. I think that there's a middle ground, which I'm trying to strike, in which, like, I'm having conversations with our photo department about the idea of like kind of doing more, feature-y photo assignments and things like that. The thing, and that's a viable option. And I think that this photo essay, which was really well received and got a couple awards, which was like, it's kind of like a proof in concept of like, hey, like this can be a viable option. At the same time, it was very stylized. It's very different. It's not really what you expect in terms of photojournalism. Won't work all the time, And so if I were to make that shift, I would have to accept that I would have to do some of the stuff that is a little bit more generic in terms of coverage, which isn't a bad thing. But it's.
It seems to me you've got the perfect situation. You've got access to one of the most interesting places in the world, access to people, just to go wander up to them, people who are used to being photographed. So it makes that process easier. You can do your day job and pursue your passion and mingle the two together. So I'd say stick with it and see where it where it leads you. I've got one question that Simon would no doubt ask, and it has to be about the lens on your camera. So you mentioned the one on that speed graphic behind you. Is that the one you're currently using, or what lens do you favor most for either portraits or more environmental shots with the 4x5?
So I got an Aero Ektar.
As one does.
I thought I noticed some swirly goings on in some pictures. Yeah.
Everybody eventually does. So I've been shooting that, like the entire photo essay was shot with the Aero Ektar.
Mm-hmm.
And then I've gotten to know Jeffrey Berliner at the Penumbra Foundation. Mm-hmm. And he sold me a fateful lens for it that I can put on it's like a brass lens. Basically, it's similar to that, but a smaller version. And that it kind of gives like this swirly, background situation, and which is totally different than obviously what you're used to seeing on Capitol Hill. And when you can make it work, it's very cool. But also, I can't use that all the time because I think that it's almost like, shooting black and white large format is so stylistic already.
Mm-hmm.
That level of weirdness is something that I can't like include all the time.
Hey now.
But it's cool when I do. I used it for the confirmation hearing for the Ketanji Brown Jackson Supreme Court nomination, and the stuff that I shot was very cool in that it kind of like it gave it a little bit more of like a feel, which is what I was going for, because I think that the backgrounds in those can be a little static, and it's nice to kind of like give it a little bit more like there was drama in the room,
right? So
kind of like using the lens to kind of show the drama in a way. But the Aero Ektar is, it's basically kind of the perfect lens for this kind of stuff, considering it's just so fast, and it allows.
So I know they were meant for aerial reconnaissance photography, and they've become sort of the cool kid's lens, which you are. You're the cool kid.
You are the
kid
cool
on the
kid.
show. You're certainly younger than both of us by the looks of it.
And it's not. I wasn't the first, obviously, to do it, and the guy that made it, the most popular is David Burnett, who I got to know when I started shooting large format during that impeachment inquiry, the impeachment trial hearings, and
was it one of those things where he looked over and he's like, and you looked over, you're like,
yeah, honestly,
you both had those ginormous like I can't remember if he's shooting a speed graphic or if he's shooting one of the RB like SLRs.
Right. Yeah. That's
Yeah. And he's like,
it'll be like two guys standing at the urinals comparing notes.
Oh, wait, hold on. British Enunciation mockery. It must be done at least once per show. What did you just say? Standing at the what?
Urinals.
Yeah, it was very like, okay. Like I thought, and it wasn't like I thought I was going to be the only person doing it, but it actually made me feel a little bit better about myself, because I was like, oh, okay, like I'm not the only person, carrying one of these crazy, ridiculous cameras. I didn't have an Aero Ektar then, but he was shooting with it at those hearings, and he did some really, really great work.
Oh.
He was, and it was very cool because, like, again, I've been so lucky to encounter these people along the way who have been so supportive, because there is a competitive nature amongst photojournalists, particularly going back to the whole idea of, if you're not staffed and like you're doing freelance work and you're really trying to like stand out and stuff like that, it can be a pretty brutal business. But most of the people that I've encountered have been super awesome and supportive. And David has been one of those people who has been like, he is an inspiration just generally, because his work, his career spans, he was there in Vietnam, and has just covered so many things along the way. And he's really, been a pioneer in proving that large format photography can be incorporated into coverage of sports and politics. In a way,
disaster recovery, his New Orleans work after the hurricane was mind-boggling, because he actually started to use tilt shift on it. And doing very selective and making like these ruinous scenes look like there was a toy car or whatever. It just really made you stop and stare in a way that, and I'm going to use this term loosely because a lot of people like expect me to do it on some of my trips, where disaster porn or ruin porn, right? it's really easy to walk into a ruined building and take a very like dramatic image in such a way as that it just almost sort of minimizes what it actually is, right? Which I might circle back to, by the way, to because I've read a bit, and you were in Haiti, after a natural disaster, and it feels to me like, and we might even be getting to this point with, like, say, the war in Ukraine, right, where all these images come after a while, we get saturated and we sort of get over it and we get used to it, when we really, as human beings, shouldn't ever get over or used to these types of images, like ever. And his use of that lens made us stop and stare and be like, what? Wait, what? And then that visual hook sort of brings you in to what you're actually looking at. It's like, oh, well, shit, this was somebody's house. This was somebody's life. Right.
Yeah. And I think, and I mean, there's a lot to discuss on that point, but like considering today, in today's age where you're scrolling on your computer or you're scrolling through Instagram, and it's easy just to go, to the next picture, to the next picture, to the next picture. Yep. Creating an image that will make somebody stop and think about what they're seeing and what they're looking at is hard to do. And he has proven the ability to do that. I mean, he covered John Kerry's presidential campaign. There's this shot he got up on, they have those little like lists that they'll bring for like big events, and he took this shot of John Kerry at this event and used the tilt chip for that shot too. And it's just, I mean, but again, like, this is the stuff that he was in the off times during these hearings was like walking me through and showing me and talking about stuff. And he's like, this is great. Like, just keep at it. I mean, and that kind of encouragement was super helpful. But I mean, but the idea of using large format and not having it just be like a gimmick, you know what I mean?
Right.
And using it in a way to actually, to actually have a reason to actually sit there and look at an image. I think it's been really inspiring. And again, like he's been a huge inspiration as to the viability of this, as not just me messing around with an old camera just to mess around with an old camera, but also like showing it as a viable option for news gathering.
Have you found that, so you shot digital primarily, and then you went to film? The Hasselblad, by the way, must have been, because the shutter on a Hasselblad sounds like, like a car crashing into a wall. Like you're in a meeting, like, shakunk. Sorry about that. Yeah. And then large format. Have you found that if you go back to digital, that's impacted your digital work? Has it slowed you down? Has it impacted how you see things? Or is it just like, meh, not at all?
No, for sure. I mean, it's definitely, the entire process has made me a better photographer in terms, just the idea of like thinking ahead of time for my shots. I mean, that was the thing that was, particularly when I was shooting the impeachment inquiry trial, the day before I would think, okay, where am I going to stand to try to get this shot? Because you need to stand and basically block out your shot, set focus, do your, light meter, figure out what the exposure time is going to be way ahead of time. And that process itself has definitely made me a better photographer. Not to mention, because of the medium, you're focusing so much more on light and where the light's coming from and how that light is going to, not make a picture just a flat image.
Right.
And, I mean, all of that kind of stuff has totally changed the way that I don't know if it's changed, but it's made me a better photographer digitally. The thing is that like I still shoot digital all the time. I mean, like, and whether it's, I shoot with a Fuji X100. I'm obsessed with that camera.
They're awesome.
That I use. And I shoot with my iPhone all the time too. But like, I try not to be too stodgy about that. I mean, I like shooting large format, I like shooting film, but I try not to get in my head about too much about, oh, I should be shooting this with film. Oh, I should be shooting this with, digital. It's, there's a time and a place for everything. And I think that, I've pushed myself to try to make sure, or to see if there are places where I can shoot film or large format in places that you wouldn't normally think about using that. But I try not to, get too caught up in what I'm going to be using at certain times.
Right.
How do you how do you think your approach to large format photography has changed since the day you first picked up the camera and walked into Capitol Hill to now? How has it evolved, for better or for worse? The way you look for pictures, stories, ideas, that sort of thing.
So, I mean, when I first started, it was really just like a general coverage, at a hearing, shooting scenes and things like that. And since then, I've really started trying to incorporate portraiture. And that has been something that I wasn't really actually practiced in at all. It was something but it's something that I was interested in doing. And this is the camera and the medium lends itself to that uniquely. It gives portraits a very, I don't know if it's like intense feel, but just like a very, it gives them a feel, and that is notable. And so I've tried to shift in that direction with the large format. Also because, I mean, from a practical standpoint, while the camera that I used early on shooting large format was coupled with that rangefinder. The Aero Ektar is not coupled with the rangefinder, so I am using the ground glass. So like to kind of step back and realize that like I might need to be on a tripod for some of that stuff. So I've kind of like evolved in that way that I've just kind of had to slow down the process even more, which has restricted me from kind of doing the handheld stuff that I was doing before. I should, to be honest, be pulling this one out a little bit more often. But yeah, I think the shift in the evolution has gone more towards like the idea of using it for portraiture, and that's what I use for the photo essay.
And how schooled? Yeah, how schooled were you in the sort of aesthetics of portraiture? I mean, there are some greats, aren't there? Who just make portraiture their own. Did you find yourself studying, the way people put their hands in photographs or the way they hold their bodies, and think how you could apply that to these guys, or did they just automatically take up a pose because they're so used to being photographed? I
mean, it is funny because so I did a ton of research. So when I did this January 6th photo essay, it was the whole thing is just a bunch of portraits, right? It's a dozen people. And when I pitched the idea, I mean, and I had not really ever had anybody sit for like a formal portrait for me for work purposes ever. I had like my family sit down for me, or friends of mine do it, but it was never anything that I had actually done in a serious or professional manner. And so I bought a ton of books. I did a bunch of research. I mean, either you get books of like the greats, or you just Google, good black and white portraits, I mean? And try to like get an idea of how they should be sitting, what, how they could face the light, what they can do with their hands, trying to incorporate the background or the foreground, seeing, what different poses you can do. It's funny because so one of the books that I got was, obviously like Richard Avedon is like,
the king.
Avedon, so like he is who he is. But one of the people that I shot for this photo essay was Congressman Jamie Raskin, and he was like, so you're a photographer? And I was like, well, I shoot pictures, I do it as part of my job. And he's like, great, one of the coolest things I have in my house is a portrait that I've shot of Richard by Richard Avedon. So I was like, oh, okay. No pressure here.
Yeah, exactly. I was just about to say that. Okay.
Yeah. And it's actually a very cool, it's in the Avedon book Power, which is just a bunch of portraits of politicians and lawmakers and government people, Pentagon people and stuff like that. but I mean, yeah. So the research that I did was basically looking at what had been done, and also looking at some of like what my colleagues had done as well. I mean, again, David Burnett, he's done some really great portraits and incorporated the Aero Ektar in large format and in some of the coverage that like you'd actually see on articles online and in newspapers. So yeah, I mean, the thing is that I did all that research and then I would stay up basically all night. I could barely sleep the night before because, I mean, when for some of these folks, I mean, like shooting portraits of, Speaker Pelosi or, Mitt Romney or some of these guys, I mean, it's like no pressure, right? I mean, like,
right.
It's one of those things that, if the negatives don't work out or you mess up, because I was developing all my own stuff and, if it doesn't work out, it's all on you. So it was a nerve-wracking situation.
So let's take a step back, because me asking you that question about how your photography's evolved, we've lurched into your project after the riot. The series of images that you took of. Was it just the 12 people?
It was 12 people, but it was every person who participated did a number of different. We sat.
Yeah.
Number of places.
So this was 100 days after the January the 6th event, the storming of the Capitol. So tell us perhaps a little bit about how this project formulated in your mind and how it was received. And So tell us a little bit about that, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah. So after January the 6th, I was in the Capitol for January the 6th, and a lot of the people that were there in the building were doing a lot of processing of that day, because I think that it was a really hard thing for people to process mentally.
Were you actually there on the day when they were trying to break in? Were you? Wow. Okay.
Well, and so it was something that we had noticed. I mean, the conversations that I had with either it was, congressional aides, the staff for the members of Congress, or even, the senators or the lawmakers, you could tell that they were really processing it from like a trauma standpoint, because it was a traumatic experience for a lot of people. And so we were trying to figure out a way to tell that story in a visually differentiating way. And we had, I talked to some of the editors at our on our website, and they're like, well, what if you did some kind of like photo essay? And I was like, well, how about this? Like, how about I was thinking about trying to do portraits of folks who were, kind of processing this. And they're like, great, like, why don't you go ahead and do that and send us some stuff and let us know what you get. It turned out to be the people who ended up wanting to participate were people that I wasn't actually anticipating them to say yes. So I got really lucky in that, I reached out to, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's office, and they're like, great, yeah, let's do it. And, Mitt Romney, who had been turned around by a Capitol police officer who was about to run right into the rioters, he agreed to do it too. He was actually one of those senators who had seen me with the camera in the hallways and be like, hey, that's a cool camera. And so it turned out to be this situation where, we got Capitol police officers who were not talking to the press because, either because personally they didn't want to talk about it, or, police are typically averse to talking to reporters who agreed to sit down. So I guess actually it was more than 12 people because there was 3 police officers. So
yeah,
it was like, I guess 14 people. And then congressional aides and trying to incorporate everybody. There was also a cafeteria worker who we spoke to who encountered, or who was locked himself in his closet room down in the basement. And so we did all these portraits, and I did them in 3 different settings. And I did them with the speed graphic with the Aero Ektar. We did like environmental portraits, and then like a straight, looking into camera with a backdrop. And they were all done with natural light, all done inside the Capitol, all done, like usually like one day at a time over a couple months.
Right.
And afterwards, after the session, after they sat for the portrait session, I would ask them the same questions about how they are processing the trauma of that day, and whether or not they felt like the Capitol was going to be the same, and and what they hoped people remembered from that day. And it turned out to be a really, it was one of those situations where like the vision kind of turns into exactly what you were envisioning, or like the product turns out into exactly what you're envisioning. And the folks at our website did an amazing job building it out. Our video department put together a video where they incorporated the audio from the interviews, because all the interviews that I had done were just like recording audio, and it just turned out really well. And I mean, it was, again, shooting that stuff was scary because of the weight of the story. And I think that having these folks trust you with their story and about like a vulnerable aspect to the story, right? Because it's like there's the actual events of what happened on January 6th. It's like the idea of like how hard it is to process that. The mental health aspect is still a little taboo for a lot of folks, and the idea of opening up on that kind of stuff and accepting or saying publicly that it is a trauma that's being processed is a hard thing to do. And so, which made you want to get the portraits right, but you also there's so many aspects or so many places in the film process where it can mess up, and it all came together really well. So it was great. And so it was received super well. I mean, and like I said, the White House News Photographers Association just got an award for that. A couple of the portraits will be included in the American Photography book for this year. It's been very, very cool the way that it's been received.
And I have to say, the ones I like about these the most, and I saw them when they came out, and I was like, oh yes, I was hoping somebody would do something like this, right? That I really like the most are, for the most part, the non-politicians, right? The folks you don't see every day, and in particular, the image, although like your image of Representative Jason Crow amidst all the stanchions and stuff, I think is just a brilliantly great framing, light, and everything. But like the image of the guy you're talking about, the cafeteria worker, where he's just looking a little bit off camera and he's looking pensive, and it matches the quote perfectly. Like, I keep an eye out. I keep an eye out all the time. Yeah. Because these are the people you don't really think about, right? That even exist. There's a whole infrastructure around government, around Congress, of people you don't really see or get acknowledged much. And those shots to me really resonate more than, because like you said, politicians are used to being approached and photographed, right?
We were, me and Simon and Erik were messaging each other. It was like, I can't even begin to imagine being inside that place when it was being stormed. And I think the people around the world just were glued to their TV sets with their jaws just hanging down. I mean, I wasn't. I know Erik and Simon wasn't. And and for people to be in there, knowing that the Capitol Police aren't able to stop this, this break in, and
or in some cases may theoretically have abetted it. But that's like mind blowing in itself, right?
And I can understand those guys inside being really traumatized even now, because how often do we hear, well, someone walked into a school and killed, half dozen kids and teachers and things. You just don't know, do you? You don't know what these guys could have been armed. They could have been hell bent on doing much more than actually did eventually. I mean, people died, didn't they? I know that, but so it's no wonder that trauma is deep set in these people. And I listened to the interview with a speaker, Nancy Pelosi, and she says something like, well, that we just don't, this isn't part of the day job, you don't come here for this. And she was really feeling it for some of the young, the youngsters in the house and stuff. And it was really powerful. The video that came with it was really powerful. And it just leads me on really to, what about your mental health, and how are you coping with it? And have you found I realize I'm asking loads of questions here. And has the photographic process this after the Riot thing? Was that kind of cathartic for you? Does that help you as well?
100%. And I mean, it was a traumatic experience when it happened. And I think that, to your whole point about for the folks that were in the building, again, it was important to incorporate somebody like a cafeteria worker and congressional aides and things like that, because I mean, you have to think about it from the perspective, and using a school is actually a good example. I mean, nowadays, I think sadly, schools are kind of prepared for the worst in those kind of situations. But I would say 99.9% of the people in the Capitol, I mean, no one ever expected something like this to happen. And they kind of, you go to the Capitol, I mean, you go through security to go in, and like they're surrounded by Capitol Police, and it's the whole thing. And you just never expect anything like that to happen. And I think that for the folks that I spoke to, and for myself as well, it's one of those things that once a place like that is violated in that way, a place that is like the safety of which you take for granted the safety of, it makes you question the safety of all the places that you go around you. Right. Even, I mean, everything, like, it's your house, it's your car, it's riding your bike. It's like, it's walking down the street. Like all the times that you kind of realize that you take for granted how safe you are. When something like that is violated, it makes you question everything around you. And so, but to your question, the answer is yes. The photo essay was incredibly cathartic in that it allowed me to also help process my own trauma through that, and also understand and appreciate that others were feeling the same way that I was. Again, I was, so you mentioned that I was in Haiti. I was there when the earthquake happened in 2010. And that was a situation where I had experienced the trauma, and I did not take the processing of that trauma seriously. And I recognize how much of a mistake that was. And so going into this experience, I kind of went through it with eyes wide open, realizing that it's important to understand, to admit like how hard it is to process, and to do the work to make sure you do it. And so I think that part of the reason why this piece was important was to show people that people who experienced this were having a hard time processing it. And so a lot of people come up afterwards being like, thank you for doing that piece, because it made me feel a little bit better about like having a hard time going through this and figuring out how to wade through, the experiences and the memories of that day, and coming through the building. Because I mean, as like everybody had to just show up to work the next day, and at the same building that this all happened. And it was just, and so it was hard. And so, so yeah, I mean, but it was a really, really wonderful, and again, that's why it was so important to get it right, because it was such an important story, because you have these people who are trusting you with their story, but at the same time, you want to get it right, because if you don't get it right, like this is in a way a service journalism for America, so that they understand the effects of this attack on the people who are in the building. But it's also a service to the people who experienced it, so that they're able to recognize that this was a hard thing for others to process as well.
Right. And that, I have a bunch of questions around this. So, but to that particular point, was this like the first piece that you did, dedicated going with 4x5, where it wasn't, like news coverage, shooting a hearing or whatnot, doesn't necessarily have that point to it, right? You're shooting a breaking event, just something but it doesn't really have that personal, super deeply personal connection or like mission to the work, right? Like this is a mission-driven piece. Is this the first like real, genuine, full-bore mission-driven piece that you've done on Capitol Hill?
Yeah, it was the first time that I talked to photo editors, and they're like, okay, like this is what we think we're going to do, and this is what we need to deliver. There was, and there was not like a ton of pressure, because I think that like if everything had fallen apart, it wouldn't have been, the end of the world. But, there was an expectation that I needed to deliver on this. Typically, there's not an expectation to deliver on the photography that I do. I do a lot of it while I'm doing my job as a reporter and producer, which is, asking questions or making sure that our video cameras are where they need to be.
Right.
Where we can cover events. A lot of the photography that I do is in the periphery, not for coverage purposes. Right. But in this situation, it was commissioned. It was like, okay, like we're going to do this. But also like that gave me the ability to go to some of these offices and be like, hey, we're doing this. And so we're going to do this piece. So it has a place to live. Right. I'm not doing this for fun or just doing it for Instagram. This is going to live on our website. It'll live on television. So we'd really like you to participate. And so, and I mean, I think that it helped also that we did it so early, because I think that, first off, it kind of like nobody else had done anything like that yet. So it was easier to get people to agree to it. And secondarily, those memories were fresh for a lot of folks during that time. I mean, some of the interviews that I did were emotional. Like, Congressman Raskin had tears in his eyes during the interview. And I mean, because it was still really fresh.
Right.
And the longer that it goes, like the more time that passes, the more it feels like it's a distant memory. And the more that, you hear people who say, oh, it wasn't really that bad, which is why it was important to get these stories out then, so that you can always look back at that and realize how bad it was. And I think that to both of your points, like everybody kind of looks at that experience and that event, and it was so bad. It could have been so much worse. And I think that that's like the very hard thing for folks to kind of wrap their heads around, is that, I mean, while the vast majority of people got out without being harmed, it's still really hard to kind of think about how bad it could have been. And so, which is why, again, I think it was important to get that piece out early and not have it be like a year anniversary. Like doing it was I think a smart way to do it.
Well, and when you say how bad it could have been, it also highlights how bad it could be, right? Because as you said, like once a place like that is violated or attacked, not everything else, you realize how unsafe everything else is, but you also realize how unsafe that place that was so safe was perceived to be, and how unsafe. I'm sure they beefed up security like crazy, but also how unsafe it actually kind of is in practice. Which brings me to the question of, in terms of reaction to the piece, but also, like in your experience as a journalist, not just a photojournalist, but a journalist with over a decade in the trenches now, sort of the increasing toxicity of the American political situation. Have you had folks like not react in a positive way to this piece, to be like, whatever, or just in general, how has that impacted your job and the things you see and how folks react to you? Like, fake news, false media, like all that sort of brouhaha. Like, what's it been like to be in the trenches covering that sort of thing in an increasingly toxic political, or just society in general has been more toxic?
I mean, it's interesting because I think that I've kind of experienced the whole spectrum of that, because I came in right around when the Tea Party movement was happening on the Hill, and that stuff felt crazy at the time. Government shutdowns, fiscal cliffs, things that were like, oh my God, this is, so crazy. And we're covering, unprecedented times. And then, the Trump era really shifted everything in a really dramatic way, not only in the way that we covered things, but just, you're right, in the sentiments towards journalists. Having covered the campaign, I mean, people would come up. I had a guy come up to me one time and just say, if there were no consequences, I would just beat the living hell out of you right now. And I mean, this is like a guy who's my age. I was like, where is this sentiment just never existed before? There was an appreciation for the press. And I understand that, like, sometimes people don't like what we write. But I mean, this sentiment really grew to such an intense level that that it has been, it's been you had to adjust, you know what I mean, and recognize that this is something that we had to navigate. I would say, covering politics is a interesting. It's a great beat to cover. I mean, I think that recently it's become a beat that's, people have to kind of like really question about whether or not it's something you want to do for your whole life, or whether or not you want to make it like a chapter. And I think that, the reaction to the piece has been overwhelmingly positive, but there's definitely been a lot of people, particularly conservatives, people who support, Donald Trump, or, question the severity of January 6th, who have criticized it, and journalists who were there on January 6th for making too big of a deal of that experience. And the thing is that, I've never, ever, ever compared what happened that day to people who have experienced war, or people who have covered wars, or people like soldiers who have been to war. Seeing people, die in the trenches, that's a totally different experience. There is a spectrum of trauma. And I think that, while mental health and the idea of like admitting that you need help in those situations is definitely been more accepted in society. It's very clear that, there's still a lot of work to do to accept that, it doesn't, you don't need to be in the literal trenches of a war to feel like you need some help processing experiences. And I mean, while I didn't get attacked on the Hill that day, I was encountered by one person who was trying to figure out who I worked for. But I mean, I had a friend who was assaulted, and like, again, it's just one of those situations where you wonder how, if things would have been just a little bit different, how they could have gotten worse. As you noted, like there could have been armed people, or there were armed people in the Capitol. Yeah. And if things had escalated in a way, who knows how it would have gone.
The building could have literally burned down.
I mean, it could have been. It's funny because I think that, a lot of people, when they look at the insurrection, they, at least initially, they were questioning, why weren't the police doing more? Like, why weren't they? I mean, they did a lot, and obviously some police officers lost their lives in the process, and they fought really hard. But in the building, itself, like, why weren't they arresting folks, throughout the entire process? I mean, I encountered officers who were just walking with rioters as they walked through the building, and it was just like kind of gobsmacked by the whole thing. But then you recognize that like that restraint was almost strategic in a way, because if things could have just escalated really, really intensely. So anyway, I mean, so I've encountered pushback on that, but also it's like, again, I think as somebody who had covered the 2016 campaign, I think that what happened in the building on January 6th in the Capitol almost felt like a sad yet logical conclusion to the whole thing, because we had encountered so much hatred and frustration during the actual campaign that it was like we were prepared for something like that mentally. Obviously not prepared for it, but like it didn't seem, it was surprising yet not super surprising.
Right. And then going forward, you're in it's an overused phrase, but in the halls of power, right? Where, and I'm not going to ask, about any specific congressional members, but, there is a part of the folks who work in Congress who are pushing that it's not a big deal narrative, or who are pushing for either because they believe in it or because for political purposes, like more of that polarization, like, because it helps consolidate base, and it helps make sure that those two sides and both sides do a certain amount of it will vote for you no matter what. So do you, like, man, mentally it's got to be, I don't think I'd be able to handle it. I'd be like, I would lose my shit working at Capitol Hill in that environment. But do you think there's a way back? Do you think like working amongst these folks that there's a way where these two sides that are really pushing very dissimilar narratives, to consolidate their voting base can de-escalate this? Because it's just not healthy. I don't think anyone could look at this and say this is a good thing, like cognitively. But do you think there's any way that we can walk back from this brink and like detoxify, deep, I call it bipolar, like America's getting bipolar, right? In a way, like, but we can like bring this back from the brink,
I think a lot of for a lot of it, the toothpaste is out of the tube and it's not really possible to get it back.
Right.
But I think that I think the polarization is probably here to stay I think it's here and it is what it is. I think there's a lot of different reasons for it, but hopefully, it's interesting. I think that January 6th, I think a lot of people thought that was going to be the event that kind of like made everybody realize like, oh, wow, like that was, we can't go down this road. This is not a road that we can do this. And this was the conclusion of, this polarization resulted in something this intense and this bad. And I think that, it's very clear that, a lot of folks have moved on. And like I said, think that it wasn't that big of a deal. So we'll see. Hopefully we'll get, I think there's hopes, but like, I don't see that coming in the near future.
And then have you found like after this intensity and whatnot, and this like intense, like cathartic project, have you started looking around for something that's a little like the opposite? Like I want to do a project that isn't this like intense cathartic thing. I want to do something that's perhaps a little like light. Now, lighter is not necessarily the best term, but you know what I mean? Like that's just something that I can just photograph and enjoy without like a heavy weight on it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, for sure. And so I'm trying to figure out like how I can, like I said, like kind of incorporate this into other stories that I want to cover, and particularly things that are outside of politics.
Right.
We've done a couple stories on like, chemicals that are like in the groundwater and stuff like that, where I've been able to shoot. It wasn't film or anything like that, but again, like trying to work with our photo department on doing kind of stories like this. It's, it's tough because I think that our news organization in particular is very like breaking news, coverage as we go kind of thing. So it's projects with this kind of like looking this far into the future are harder to come by, but that's definitely something that I'm trying to work on. I also, in terms of like projects to cover with my camera that are not politics, I have a 2-year-old daughter that I do a lot of pictures of.
Dude, there's so much kids are so much fun to photograph, especially before they get the ability to be like, Dad, get that camera out of my face, like my 15-year-old son does.
Oh, wow. I'm waiting for it. It's going to be a real bummer.
Have you had a chance to photograph Joe Biden or the vice president at all?
Yeah. Well, so I took a picture of Vice President Harris. I covered her, previously when she was a senator, and then I've covered her in the Capitol. I took a shot of her walking through the rotunda on her way to the not Supreme Court, to a joint address of Congress. That again was one of those like, you have a vision for a shot and it kind of like completely turns out, and it's like she's kind of backlit by the American flag, and it turned out really well. I think it is like one of those things that I would like to shoot the White House in this way. But it's a different beat. It's a different group of people. And it's like that would be me. I don't know. It's like a different turf, you know what I mean? Right. So like it would take a level of approvals and getting into the White House and stuff like that. It's a tough thing to do.
Well, in a couple of years' time, you might have Mr. Trump to try and photograph again.
He might be back. Yeah. So I think, they come to the Hill enough that I'm able to kind of like shoot them in that way.
We have to just be careful using these unfortunate terms that we use for photography. And when we're talking about riots on Capitol Hill, you're talking about shooting Donald Trump. I mean,
I've had people tell me, like, I'm going to go shoot this portrait. I'm going to go shoot this event. They're like, is that really the right term to use nowadays? I'm like, I keep trying to wean myself off of it, but I know
we always use it.
I went to school for photojournalism in the 90s, and this was just not a thing to worry about.
Shooting Donald Trump was fine. Then,
or I'm a shooter. I'm a freelance shooter. People like.
I was like standing in a hallway, waiting. There was like this, interesting slivers of light coming through a window one day, and a senator came through, and I was like taking shots as they were passing right through these like slivers of light. He was like, shots fired. And like, I had to like go over to his office or his communication staff later. And I was like, you should tell him not to say that. Like, it's not like, as much as, it's like a funny, a lot of the words that we use in journalism kind of have weird connotations. Like when we have a story that doesn't end up getting aired, it gets killed. Like, killed. You're like, oh God, it's so.
Yeah. Or buried.
It's awful.
But
yeah, I know it is kind of funny.
So earlier on, you mentioned rabbit holes that you were either going down or wanting to go down when it comes to using film.
Yeah.
What would you'd like to expand on these particular rabbit holes? I'm always interested to talk about rabbit holes.
Well, so I mean, you guys know Jason Lane, and so he, the glass plate, the dry plate thing has definitely been a rabbit hole that is fun to go down because again, talking about like increasing the degree of difficulty,
but by a fair factor.
Large format is pretty high up there already. Doing it with glass plates is like even higher. And it was one of those things. I had never done tray developing either, so even developing that kind of stuff was a new and different, but fun thing to do. That kind of stuff. Even when it's like it's not even, it doesn't have to be large format, right? We talk about the disposable cameras. Lomography, making that that's like purple tinted. They make that Metropolis stuff that's a little like yellow tinted too. Kind of like seeing how to use those kind of different things to cover Congress in like a visually differentiating way has been something that like it's been really cool. And in terms of like the rabbit holes, just like trying new things and realizing there's other new different options out there.
You've just got the film. You've got the film bug, haven't you? That's really what it is.
Right. It's just the film bug. But it is. But it does feel like. There's pinhole cameras. Like I look at that. I've been trying to figure out how I can go like incorporate that into coverage. So
he runs a lensless podcast as well. You want to talk about pinholes?
So maybe we'll get you on that show as well. So my other podcast hat is the Lensless Podcast, and that's been going a little while now. And I think we're up to maybe show 116 or something.
I've figured out a way to do it. Using a pinhole camera inside is kind of hard to do, and I'm trying to make it look like it's just like a bunch of nothingness, because you're exposing it along.
Well, it can be. You've got. Of course, it depends all about the light, doesn't it, and the speed of film you put in, and you can end up with anything from no people present at all, which is kind of interesting and spooky at the same time, to having ghosts or pretty solid people, really. So choose your spot carefully, choose your film speed carefully. All I would say is we had on our last Lenses podcast, we had Sam Cornwall on, and Sam is the guy behind a product that was launched a few years ago called the Solar Can. So solography, you take in its basic form, you take something like a beer can, so you get to drink the beer, you put a hole in it and you put photographic paper inside, and you go and attach the beer can to a lamppost facing the sun for 6 months. And you end up with traces of the sun's arc across the sky, burning into the paper. So it's not exposing paper, it's actually physically burning into the paper. And so when you take the paper out of the can after 6 months, you get there's a kind of muddy image of the light trails and the immediate foreground or whatever else the beer can is picking up. And you can invert it and scan it, as many times as you want, and eventually it'll fade, but not too quickly. And because the biggest problem is putting beer cans on lampposts in public spaces is now they come with it, say this is not a bomb, because they get taken down. So you can't leave things around the Capitol building. You need to seek, let me just a word of advice. Don't just put a beer can, tape it to a post and leave it there.
Or a chair leg, whatever.
Yeah, that would probably not work in the Capitol. That's the thing, is that like particularly with that kind of stuff, I mean, it has to stay still. I mean, putting up tripods inside on the Capitol is, you can only do that in certain places, and so you have to get kind of creative as like where you put it.
Yeah, well, some of the best things you can do with a pinhole camera is not overthink it too much. You can get reality so subtle pinhole cameras.
I was just going to say
6x6 film, tiny little pocketable camera, and you plonk it somewhere during a meeting. I mean, when I was at a full-time day job, we'd have business dinners in the evening, like in Germany or France, and I'd say to folks, I'm just putting this up here, and you put a camera behind you, and I'd just forget about it. I'd open the shutter up. I had no idea on exposure. And at the end of the evening, you get a picture of the table, and you can see people. There's a lot of ghosting around, but it's kind of fun, and you just almost use it you can almost use the pinhole camera like an iPhone, but obviously not really like an iPhone, to just capture the moment in the same way as you would with an iPhone, but it's just something a bit different. Put a fast film in.
I was going to say,
use a well-lit area.
You definitely want to go with rally. So we definitely want to go with James pinholes because they're clean and beautiful. But I'm glad you mentioned the 6.6. I have one. It's like the ultimate street photographer's pinhole camera.
It is.
It's really,
don't worry about
really
tripods.
Fast.
Just plonk it wherever you can plonk it.
It's an f137. So outdoor, it's actually really, really fast. And I was like, man, what could you do with 3200 ASA 35 film? Like taking, because it's medium format, take Delta 1600 and push it to 3200.
Oh, I'll put the Delta 3200 in one of James's cameras, and I've shot that in broad sunlight. And of course, it's saying you need like an exposure of 0.3 of a second or something.
Yeah, which is really hard with a pinhole, by the way. You're like,
Yeah. That's very cool. It's almost like a photographic time lapse. Like,
well, that's the thing. You see, so with pinhole, you're opening up a whole third dimension. You're not just capturing that little moment. You're capturing whole chunks of time, aren't you? And that makes you think in a completely different way. I think it's wonderful. You should certainly pursue it. And you'll one of James's cameras, like the Reality So Subtle 6x6, would be, there you go. That's the little kitty. So that just pops in your pocket. Hold it up again to the camera for the viewers.
And this is the F, so it takes a filter on it.
Yeah, that's
and
what
it's
I've got.
He uses the radio dials on the top. It's beautifully wide. It's the best built. He makes the best, most professionally built pinholes anywhere. They're fast to load. They're fast to shoot. They're pocketable. They're light. And he's a lovely, lovely guy. He's one of my favorite people, I think, in the small photography, photography world.
He's actually made. Do you know what his latest venture is? Well, his latest venture, which is not going to be commercial, is he made a pinhole camera which takes like, what size film is it, Erik? It's huge, like ultra large format pinhole camera. We got sheet film, and he stuck it all together with sellotape. And
yeah, he made I think it was a 4x10 panoramic pinhole camera, it was like 8x16 or something. But but with rolls. It wasn't just sheet film. He took X-ray film and taped it together in a giant roll and was just like hand cranking this giant roll of X-ray sheet film, taking these huge like 8x16 or whatever panoramics. He made this like a ginormous camera. It was bonkers silly. Which is one of the things I love.
What he is working on now, which is going to be commercial. So you're going down the film rabbit hole, Frank. Have you got a roll of color film and wound it on to another reel backwards and shot through the non-emulsion side? So that's called red scale photography. Have you tried that?
Oh.
So you can take a roll of color film, or you can even buy at Lomography sell red scale film. Basically, it's film that normally when you put a roll of film in a camera, the emulsion faces the lens, doesn't it? That's what happens. So in a darkened room or a bag, you wind the film onto another roll, but the other way around. So when you shoot it in the camera, you've got the anti-halation layer, the backing of it, the shiny side, facing the lens. So you're shooting through the back of the camera, and that can, depending on the speed that you rate the film at, it can either go very reddish or very orangey, and people have different tastes on that. Well, James is making a pinhole camera called a red scale pinhole camera, and it's got pinholes on both sides. So on one roll of film, you can either red scale it or just do a normal shot. And it's just bonkers.
Or both on the same frame.
Or both, I don't know how that works, but you can.
Yeah, I don't either. I kind of want to try it, right? I'm for the listeners. Frank is looking up in the sky, like thinking about what would happen if you expose both sides. Like, yeah, exactly. Like,
yeah, that's interesting. Wow, that's super cool. Yeah, I mean, but you're right. So I mean, I guess the bottom line is that yes, I think I probably have just gotten the film bug. I mean, like, I do think that. I mean, like, even, wet plate stuff, which is, would be super interesting.
Well, that'd be now. So would you be able to get your wet plate darkroom through the security,
Yeah, all those bottles of chemicals.
That's part of the reason. I mean, there's two reasons why I haven't really gone down that road. First off, the infrastructure that it requires to, like, have all those chemicals, and I have a 2-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
God forbid she, ran into that stuff. But secondarily, you're right. Like, the practical usage for that would be really almost impossible to do on the hill. It would. I don't know if they would ever let me.
You'd have to be outside.
I think so.
You'd have to set it up outside and have the folks come to you.
Or you have nuclear powered strobes, don't you? I mean,
right?
Yeah, the really, really big heads that feels like you've been hit by like a solar flare when they go off.
Well, that's the other thing is that, like, I mean, as I said, for the photo essay, all those portraits were taken with natural light.
Yep.
I can, I don't have that kind of equipment to be able to.
What camera do you have that Aero Ektar mounted on?
The speed graphic.
On the speed graphic, they are. Then I'm sorry, I side Googled while we're talking. It's a 7-inch Aero Ektar, right?
Mm-hmm.
That works out to 177.8 millimeters, and Graflex Parts has 177.8 millimeter rangefinder cams. So when you said that you have to use the ground glass for it, no, you don't. If you want to, you can get a rangefinder cam just for that lens, pop it in there, and your rangefinder is going to work for that lens. You just have to open it up and swap cams. So if you want to not use the ground glass, like, it's definitely and those cams are only $20.
Yeah.
He's great. Yeah.
He did the CLA for the speed graphic.
Okay.
The Aero Ektar on it. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I was going to say, because you could totally not ground glass it if you didn't want to.
Yeah, I probably should. I mean, it's also a lot heavier. I mean, like that lens is super heavy.
Oh, yeah, dude.
So again, like.
But how do you think the dynamics of those photo sessions, your after the Riot session, how would it have changed, or how would it have been different if you were hand holding rangefinder as opposed to a lot of them where you had it on tripods? How would that? Do you think the project would have worked out differently?
I think that that's an interesting question. I think that part of the purpose of that project was to kind of sit down and take a beat and have like people think about the moment a little bit.
Yeah.
So if I was handheld, or if it was even like digital, or Hasselblad handheld or something like that, it would have given it a little bit more of a frenetic feel to it. Like I liked the idea that we were taking a moment, taking a beat. It's on a tripod, explaining the camera to folks. For some people who understood what the camera was, but others were like, I've never seen anything like that before. And so I think, having an idea and having it on a tripod was an effective way to kind of like have them kind of sit down and think, okay, like I'm taking a picture.
Right.
A lot of the times these pictures were taken in places that had a significance to the person from that day.
Okay.
So for instance, like the cafeteria worker was standing in the hallway just outside of the room that he had locked himself in when it happened. Speaker Pelosi was in her office, which was ransacked. Jamie Raskin was sitting in the office just off the House floor that his daughter and son-in-law were hiding in, as the rioters were banging on the door trying to get in. So like trying to kind of like live in the moment, like when you're moving around and taking pictures and things like that, it's easy for the person getting the picture taken, who you're taking the picture of, to kind of like think about what's happening around them.
Right.
And when they're able to kind of just stand there and think about the moment, I think a lot of the emotion that came out in those portraits was a result of the fact that like they were standing there thinking about what they were doing.
Right. I hadn't appreciated that. Okay. That adds another layer to it. So that, I suppose really then, just one more question on this sort of project. Thinking of all the elements that went into it, the close proximity to the event, having the portraits made in the environment which meant so much to these people, the closeness to the event and all the trauma. Does that mean that you won't be able to follow up and do more of this? Would it lose something? Is that something you've considered? Can we revisit the project? Would it lose some of its meaning? Would you have to do it differently?
Yeah.
Have you even considered it?
I have. That's a very good question, because particularly initially right after it was published, there was a lot of folks that were like, you're going to keep doing this, right? Like, and I kind of had to make I actually like went back and forth. People were like, you should make a book of this. Like, you should do this as like kind of a almost like a historical record almost. But I kind of made the decision to kind of let it live as what it is. Let the project live as the piece that it was published as. I think that there is a way to follow up. I don't know if it's, the year anniversary is past, so I don't know if it's like a checking with people, years from now to try to figure out like how they are feeling about that day. I thought about trying to incorporate or trying to do this with other folks as well, other folks who were there. But again, like one of the things that I was really proud of, and one of the things that we touched upon is like, it did kind of incorporate enough people from the spectrum of folks who were in the building, like the cafeteria worker and the aides and, the police officers, that I feel like it did. There's no way that you ever comprehensively cover a story. You can't talk to everyone, but I feel like it did a good job of comprehensively telling that story. And so I think about it a lot, about like how I can kind of like extend the life of this sentiment, but I also think that it kind of did a good job in that moment of telling the story that it needed to tell.
I think so. It occurred to me when we were talking about mental health, and the whole thing's been about mental health really, but is this something that you could work with a mental health charity on and say, well, actually talk about what you've been talking to us about, but to people who are affected with mental health issues? Youngsters, it's a huge issue, isn't it, with young people for all sorts of different reasons. Have you thought about that, of using these images in some way?
Yeah, yes. And the thing is that I've been trying to advocate. No joke, I would give anybody after it happened, especially in like the couple of weeks right after it happened, while people were really having a hard time processing it, and there was still, trash in the building and they're still cleaning it up. I would give everybody that I would talk to, whether it was a lawmaker or whether it was an aide or whether it was a cafeteria worker or whatever, like an elevator pitch as to why, the importance of talking to somebody and trying to process it. If this could be used in any way to try to advocate to let people accept that, experiencing things like these can be hard to do. Like I would 1000% try to use that. I don't know if that means it's like turned into some kind of workbook, or if it's just kind of incorporated as just like into the piece is just included into like the, into like the work of a class or something like that. I mean, that would be amazing. I think that, but like I said, as the time goes by, I think it's harder to have these conversations with folks, because I think that as the time goes by, it's people don't talk about or think about it as much as they used to.
Or it's viewed through a different lens, like no longer the lens of immediacy, but the lens of politics. And like, and its reflection on society. I was going to say, for like a follow-up would be interesting, maybe. And this is driven mostly like thinking about what projects might be relevant to this. Eugene Richards, I don't know if you know his work or not. He did a really incredible book and series called War is Personal, where he just spent time photographing veterans who'd come back from the Gulf and Iraq War and whatnot. Gene's work is very intimate, to say the least. And it made me think of like the officers on the Hill during that time. There weren't just like a dozen, there were hundreds of them doing things they'd never probably thought they'd ever do, ever signed up for, or anything like that. Some of them with long-term physical, injuries and probably a lot of mental health. And the police are you typically seen as like, we're the tough people. We don't need any of that stuff. And it was interesting for me to see like the Capitol Police Union come out and be like, yeah, this is fucked up. Yeah. Which typically they don't weigh into politics. They don't weigh, especially like conservative versus liberal. So that could be a really interesting approach, because the police union might be open to like having some of their members who are going through a lot of shit, because they want their officers humanized. Right. And that could be an interesting like series of portraits, or even just like taking your digitals and spending time with officers on and off duty, and like seeing what this is like and just how their lives have been affected by this. Yeah,
totally. I mean, the New York Times, I think in their magazine, they did a piece that featured like 2 or 3 officers that were like going through rehab and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. I mean, genuinely, the hardest part about it is just getting people to want to talk to you. Generally, people don't want to talk about this kind of stuff. It's hard to talk about police officers in particular.
Well, in that kind of traditionally macho environment, it's been a thing, hasn't it? I mean, my father, my late father, who's, I mean, if he was alive, he'd have been about 100 now, I think. He spent 3 or 4 years at the hands of the Japanese in Changi jail, in World War II. And he never spoke a word about it. I mean, he kept all that stuff bottled in. I'm sure it came out in different ways, but, there's been a whole history of machismo, isn't there, around feelings and particularly with men.
Yeah. And I mean, and so I think that was one of the reasons why, again, the photo essay was kind of a culmination of, I mean, no joke, like a decade of relationships. And it was like I knew the cafeteria worker just from talking to him. I mean, every day he makes coffee for, lawmakers and aides, and you see him, his name is Dion, and you're just like saying, hi, the reason why people agree to do these things is whether, usually because they want to talk, but also because they trust you. And establishing that trust is hard to do. I mean, and that goes to the whole like polarization situation, is that the demonization of the press and really selling somebody on the idea that you're going to take their story and do it justice and not misconstrue it in any way has always been something that journalists have had to deal with, but it's that way, and it's exacerbated now. So, convincing somebody that, hey, like, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do it right. And I think that one of the reasons why I think this photo essay was so great is that if you saw the video, it just lets the words speak for themselves.
Right.
And that's actually one of the things that I really appreciated about what our treatment of this piece is that, it doesn't portray it in there's no, I mean, and there's a time and a place for analysis. And I think that this piece, the reason why it was so powerful was that it just let the words speak for themselves, and the people speak for themselves as what their experiences were and how they were processing it.
Well, I think that's a fine time to bring this element of the podcast to a close, Frank. Wow, it's been awesome. Thank you so much for coming on, agreeing to talk to us and share a little bit more about this. This time that we all watched on TV, and it was almost like watching a video game. That's what it felt like. Or you think, well, this can't be real, and yet people's lives were touched and transformed, and you were right at the heart of it. And I think what you've done is raise the day in people's consciousness, the effects of it and the mental health issues. So well done. Yeah. Well done to you.
And I'd just like to ask is, I guess, like my closing question is like, well, what does the future hold for you in terms of your photography? Like, where do you want to go with this? Either like if a project you have in mind, or just like what do you want to do next? Right. Because you started in 2018, you're relatively new to this per se. And you've hit it running, and gone remarkable places in a very short period of time, which is awesome. So like, what's the future hold, or what do you hope the future holds for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like I said, I'm hoping that there's going to be more projects like this in the future. And, it's basically the focus is carving out time to do it. NBC gave me the time and the space to work on this project. And like I said, it took, a month and a half or 2 months to do. And so I think it's either incorporating into the politics. I mean, using that portraiture it can either be a project or for, just an article on a person, like a profile. And then also just trying to figure out how I can incorporate it into future stuff. I mean, if it's, I've encountered a lot of people along the way that have given me like historical context as like into my work. And back in the 60s, during the conventions, NBC hired a photographer to basically like shoot the conventions, have this like behind the scenes look. They developed and processed and printed out pictures every day so that they could run them for their like nightly broadcasts for the conventions. And so just trying to like think of ways that I can kind of try to incorporate this into the stuff that I'm doing already, but also trying to pitch longer term projects. I mean, I'd love to cover things that are not politics too, because while politics is interesting and stuff like that, it's also, so.
Cool. Brilliant. Well, we look forward to whatever it is you turn your hands to, because I'm sure it'll be brilliant.
Yeah.
Got a few formalities to go through. We have a coffee account. Oh. Simon's particularly keen for us to push the coffee donation so he doesn't have to keep paying for the hosting of the podcast. And I did actually, we historically, people have trouble finding it, but I found it easily. So if you go to ko-fi.com/large format photography podcast, you can buy us a cup of coffee.
You can buy us a cuppa.
You can buy us a cuppa and keep Simon happy. I didn't prime you guys about this one, but very often we do shout outs. So something you want to. Erik normally shouts out to his wife and
my long-suffering wife.
So Erik, any shout outs for you?
Always, as always, Heather, my long-suffering wife, for putting up with my crap. But also lately, I've been really blessed to have gotten like more work published and actually, start getting paid for work, which is crazy. So, just a shout out to Josh Weissman, the editor at The Rativist, who's backed my work, and to the publisher and editor of The Mountain Flyer, who's about to do a feature of my work in their first ever photo annual, which is crazy still for me to contemplate. But just also in general, the cycling community who've allowed me to not just take superficial photos, but to actually interview them on really difficult questions, and all the changes that are coming to that world that really reflect the societal changes we're seeing as a whole. So,
well, I think there's, not to draw too many parallels, but the fact that you're kind of immersed in that world of cycling maybe opens some doors and makes that photography easier in the same way that Frank is involved in the world of politics.
Yeah, for sure. So that whole crew, and then also to my co-host Simon, who is not here looking in his usual noir self, and Andrew for just having me on, and the community in general, and then of course Frank who's at my bottom of my Zoom, for taking a random Instagram message from me and being like, yeah, that sounds great. So thanks for coming on, for real.
Frank, anyone you'd like to give a mention or a shout out to?
I mean, my partner who's upstairs, she's upstairs with our daughter, allowing me to take the time to talk to you guys, allowing me to build a dark room in the unfinished part of the basement over there.
Nice.
Oh, yeah, I didn't get to talk about dark rooms. We'll have to do that another time.
So, I mean, I guess the biggest shout out would be for her. And I mean, honestly, and I would say probably just like all my colleagues, all my coworkers who deal with me lugging these big cameras around and are very gracious in their support, or at least difference.
Other film photographers come out of the closet since you've been walking around and people said, hey, actually, I've got a Pentax.
Oh, yeah. I mean, definitely. And it's either photography, like the photojournalists who are like pulling out film cameras who are, who had them before and like, this is a great idea. Maybe pull this out, or even just, aids and stuff like that. I mean, this is honestly like talking to you guys, and it's just another, example of the community. It's just been such a really supportive and amazing support system throughout this whole thing. I mean, like all the photojournalists that have encouraged me along the way. It's also, it's people like you guys who do these kind of podcasts, who like encourage people who are going through, this addiction and film that,
which we don't try to actually like wean them off the addiction. We're like, no, keep getting addicted. Go deeper into the rabbit hole. We're like dealers. Like, come on, get in there.
In the world. So I think that I'm just going to go with this one. And so I mean, honestly, I appreciate you guys, like, and folks like you who want to talk about this stuff, because it makes, it gets me inspired and it gives me ideas. And so,
excellent. Well, there's loads of, I'll give a shout out to, some of my favorite podcasts. Long-standing FPP, film photography podcast, which was the first podcast that I ever listened to. So
the granddaddy.
Yeah, the granddaddy of podcasts. And then I listened to your interview with was it the Grainy Days guys? Was it Grainy Days?
It was Grainy Days.
Is it me?
Yeah, you, Frank.
Yeah, you.
That was, I think, like the first thing. That was like the first interview that I'd ever done about film.
It was, yeah. Yep.
Early. That was early on.
Yes, it was.
I listened to that while I was in the dark room last year sometime, I think it was. I don't know. It was a while ago that you did it, wasn't it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It was, yeah.
Was that before the riots or after the riot?
I think it was before, because I think it was before. I think it was before, because it was after, I mean, like, we had published a bunch of the stuff from the impeachment, like the earlier impeachment stuff. Got things, people interested, but yeah, so that was earlier on.
Okay. Yeah, well, so I'd point folks over to Grainy Days podcast to hear an earlier version of Frank. Erik, if someone wants to send us an email, where do they send it to?
Oh, you're a jerk. You send it to large photography. No, damn it. You put me on the spot, sir. Large format photography podcast @gmail.com.
Yeah, that's right.
I always want to append the to the beginning. I always, you got me. I usually put pressure on the person saying the name for them to up, but you got me on the email. You, sir. Although I'm still going to chortle over how you say urinal. Oh. Sorry.
Urinal. It's a bit like, right. Is it Uranus or Uranus?
We're not going there, sir.
Okay. So, Frank, if people want to see more of your work and follow you on the social medias,
where do we go?
Where does one go to?
So,
where do we go? Where do we look?
Frank Thorp V. The V is for the fifth.
Is that because you tried having Frank Thorp, but you were beaten to it?
Somebody beat me to it. Yeah, my Twitter is @Frank Thorp, and I tried to get my Instagram to be the same, but somebody beat me to it. And somebody who even posts. I wanted to ask him one day, be like, "Hey, yeah, can you trade me?" But it's fine. I mean, so it's Frank Thorp B, and I have a website that will probably come up eventually, but I'm not going to tell you what that is because it doesn't exist right now. So I own the URL, but it's not going to. Won't bring you to anything yet. So,
and the Instagrams?
The Instagram is Frank Thorpe D.
Okay, there we go. And I think you're our first guest to have a blue tick against his Twitter name, I think.
Oh,
Yeah.
So we're very honored to have a
You're
blue
official.
tick, a blue tick Twitterer. Erik, where can people find you?
I do have a website
if they're so disposed.
Yeah, if they're desperate enough to if they really just want to see photos of bunnies and handmade camera lenses and occasionally photographs. Instagram is pretty much the place. ErikHmathy. I have a website, but who the hell maintains a website nowadays?
You're doing some great stuff with your bicycle pictures, with weird lenses and stuff.
Yeah.
And most of those, you've been sharing those widely, haven't you, in various places?
Yeah, those are mostly on the Radavist. TheRadavist.com. If people didn't want to search there, they'll find my work there. Frank, you were about to say something.
Well, on the website thing, I mean, I thought that too. I was like, why would anybody maintain a website? It seems like a lot of work. But I mean, you're mentioning that you're getting stuff published and stuff like that. A lot of people look for people's websites.
Yeah. It's just a pain to maintain, you throw up on Instagram and there it is. It takes 30 seconds or whatever, but a website, and I used to do websites for a living. Photography is sadly not my day job. So I'm sort of torched out on building and maintaining websites. It's but you're right. I should be more professional and I should maintain my website.
You should. And if anyone wants to follow me, they can follow me. Oh, I just had an Eminem song lipped into my head then.
I want to hear you say it. Do it.
No.
Oh, damn it.
No, I can't. No, it probably involves swearing. I'm Warboys Snapper in most places, or Andrew Bartram, and so that's. How
do they spell Bartram?
Bartram.
Thank you. Some people might not know.
Okay, well, I'm so famous. I'm sure you'll find me. And the LFPP has a Facebook group, of course, our lovely Facebook group. So join that if you're not a member, even if you don't.
Please come. Facebook. We're a friendly bunch.
We have an Instagram account which Simon is desperately trying to offload for me to run. We only ever share pictures of the logo with the host's photograph on, so that's good. And we have a Flickr.com group, which I'm very remiss at not going to very often. And finally, we have to thank Kevin MacLeod, who allows us, I guess is the right word, to use the music, which is called, Erik, do you know? Can you remember what our theme music's called?
I really can't, actually.
It's called Two-Fingered Johnny. Yes.
Is that because the whole British
I have no idea. But
I mean, I've always wondered that.
We never dwell on the song, and or the piece of music, but it's a most appropriate piece of music and well beloved and well loved by everyone who listens to the podcast. So, Frank, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Honor and a pleasure, and it's wonderful that you've got a blue tick on Twitter as well. So we'll have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see you folks out in podcast land probably in a month's time.
Yep,
we hope.
We have a couple of great people lined up.
We do. Yes,
we do.
More of that later.
Yep.
Okay, everybody. Bye.
Take care.
Bye.